evening, everybody, unless of course you're watching this video in the evening. In that case, good evening, and you are watching Time Travel TV, and today we are going to be talking about the Treaty of Versailles. So, let me set some context first. First of all, the First World War ended with an Allied victory, and that means the Germans lost. Now, by this time, the Allies were pretty much miffed off with the Germans, so they wanted their pound of flesh, if you will. So they decided to set out the peace terms in the Treaty of Versailles, which they started negotiations on in 1919. So, just to make sure it was absolutely fair, they invited delegates from all over the place. Everybody who was involved in the First World War took part, unless of course you were fighting on the side of the Germans, because the Germans weren't invited, the Austro-Hungarians weren't invited, the Turkish weren't invited, not to my knowing anyway. But it's okay because everybody else was invited. Most notably, we have got Woodrow Wilson, who was President of America. We have George Clemons, who was President of France. And finally, we've got the Prime Minister of Britain, David Lloyd George. So, where do they all stand? Well, going into this, Germany thought they're going to have a good deal, because Woodrow Wilson had already set out in his 14 points what he expected, and what he expected was, well, fairly moderate, and quite fair, to be honest. So Germany thought we're going to be okay, because Woodrow Wilson has got our back. Except this was really not the case, because other people had other things in mind. Now, David Lloyd George of Britain, he personally wasn't very interested in punishing Germany, although he knew that the British public did want their pound of flesh, so he went in there with a sort of a mediocre approach. A bit harsher than Woodrow Wilson, but not all in harsh. And then there was George Clemenceau, who was the President of France, and he was very angry. He really did want his pound of flesh. Coincidentally, I'm quoting that quite a bit. It's from The Merchant of Venice, which is a Shakespeare play, which you should definitely look into, because it's a good Shakespeare play. Anyway, so he was very keen on punishing Germany. Mainly because France had been devastated by the First World War. Most of the fighting had been in France. Of course, there was lots of fighting elsewhere, like in Belgium and Italy and on Russia, for instance. But a lot of the fighting had been concentrated in France. And France had been, well, if you've had a war fought in your country, lots of bad things happen. Things get blown up. So he wanted Germany to pay. Anyway, so the discussions went on, and in 1919, later on that year, they finally came up with what they decided was a fair deal. Now, Germany got a bit cross by it, because it wasn't very favourable on their part. Let me explain. So, first of all, their army was reduced to 100,000, which by 1919 standards is teeny tiny. They weren't allowed to have an air force, which really miffed them off. Their navy was severely cut. They weren't allowed any capital battleships or any submarines. Furthermore, they weren't allowed to develop tanks, which had become a big part of the First World War. Tank warfare, especially at the latter part. So things weren't looking too good militarily. What about otherwise? Well, they weren't allowed to form an alliance or merge with Austria, ever. And they were to sign something called the War Guilt Clause, which basically meant the war was Germany's fault. And you could argue it was, but to be honest, if something as complicated as a war has got to start for more than one reason, and you can't always just say, Germany did it. That doesn't always work like that. And it never worked like that, as a matter of fact. Anyway, they signed the War Guilt Clause, and they said, what does this mean? What does this mean? What's War Guilt Clause mean? I said, yes, we're glad you noticed that. That basically means the war was your fault, and you've got to pay for all the damages and putting everything right. And they went, hey, that's going to cost a lot of money. We won't be able to pay all this. They said, well, how much do we have to pay? Well, we haven't quite decided yet, but when we have decided, we'll let you know. Just start paying us now and we'll tell you when to stop. So this sort of frightened Germany a bit. And in 1921, the final reparations bill, reparations is what they called it, the money they paid, the final reparations bill was set at 132 billion Reichsmarks, gold Reichsmarks more precise, which is a hell of a lot of money, which is equivalent to $33 billion. And that is an absolute colossal amount. So they said, oh my God, we just can't do this. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Help! So they said, yes, print money. That's a good idea. Why didn't we think of this before? Let's just print more money. But the problem is, the more money they printed, the less valuable the money became. Think of it this way: a rare antique vase is valuable because it's rare. If you got a currency, the more you make of it, the less rare it becomes, the less it's worth. So your money could buy less and less and less. Put it in perspective, I mean, we live in England at the moment, unless of course you're not watching this in England, but we have pounds. So therefore, if the government printed more money and didn't stop, the pound would be worth less, and therefore we can buy less with our pound. If there was only £1 in the entire universe, then it would be worth lots and lots of money, because it will be able to buy lots more because there's only one of it. Anyway, so their money started to, well, collapse, and in 1923 you had something called the Hyperinflation Crisis, which meant that's what happens when it loses value. It's called inflation, which was very, very detrimental to the German economy and almost ended the Weimar Republic, until somebody called Stresemann came along and said, yes, scrap the Reichsmark and change it with the Rentenmark. So there we have it. The Treaty of Versailles almost wrecked Germany, to be honest did, and probably, if it wasn't for the Treaty of Versailles, World War II wouldn't have started. So that's great. You end one war, and to celebrate, you start another war. So I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, please subscribe to Time Travel TV, and I shall see you next time.